The day Simon Turner decided he was done with the world sent Henrietta Thatcher rolling into Caldwell, Kansas on a wagon with a broken wheel, a mule named Biscuit, and enough determination in her brown eyes to shame the sun. It was the spring of 1879, and Caldwell sat right on the edge of the Kishom Trail like a man who hadn't quite decided whether to step forward or fall back. The cattle drive still thundered through in summer, leaving behind dust and dung and enough noise to rattle teeth. But in March, the town breathed a little slower, and the men who lingered there were the kind who had nowhere better to be. Simon Turner was one of those men, though he would have argued otherwise on most days and said nothing about it on the days that mattered. He was sitting on the front porch of Haverson's General Store, whittling a piece of wood that had no intention of becoming anything useful, when he heard the wheel crack. The sound carried clean through the still morning air like a rifle shot, and every head in the small market square turned. Simon did not turn. He kept his eyes on the wood shavings falling to the boards beneath his boots, because looking at things only invited complications, and Simon Turner had made a quiet philosophy out of avoiding complications. He was 31 years old. He had a lean face that the sun had weathered past its time, dark hair that needed cutting, and eyes the color of the Kansas sky when a storm was deciding whether to commit. He owned a horse named Cobb, a bedroll, a good rifle, and the clothes on his back. He rented a room above the saloon from a man named Denny Pitts who never asked questions, which was the primary qualification Simon required in a landlord. He had no family left. His mother had gone to fever when he was 12. His father had drunk himself into an early grave 4 years later. His older brother, Cole, had ridden south toward Texas with a cattle outfit and never come back, killed in a stampede 2 years past. Simon had received the news by way of a letter he'd read 3 times and then set fire to, not from grief, but because keeping it felt like keeping an open wound. He had no land, no cattle, no future plans he bothered to speak aloud. He worked odd jobs shoeing horses when the livery was backed up, riding fence line for the Hennessy Ranch when they needed an extra hand, loading freight at the rail depot. He spent his evenings in a hard wooden chair with a glass of something that kept the quiet from pressing too loud. He was not miserable. He was not happy. He was simply present, like a fence post that had stopped expecting to hold anything. So when the wagon wheel cracked and the voices in the square rose with the particular mixture of curiosity and amusement that small towns reserve for misfortune not their own, Simon went on whittling. He lasted approximately 45 seconds. The woman's voice cut through the noise with a precision that was not rude but was undeniably clear. "I can see the wheel is broken," she said, loudly enough to carry but without any panic in it. "What I need is someone who knows how to fix it. Does anyone in this town possess that skill, or are we all just going to observe together?" Simon looked up. She was standing beside the tilted wagon with her hands on her hips, and she was not what he expected. She was perhaps 26 or 27, with dark auburn hair tucked under a practical hat that had seen weather, wearing a blue calico dress under a canvas coat that was sensible rather than pretty. She was not small. She had a posture that said she had stood her ground before and expected to do so again. Her face was fine-featured but not delicate, with the kind of jaw that suggested she'd been set since birth. She was looking at the gathered men with an expression that was not helpless and not angry but simply waiting for useful information. The men looked at each other. Nobody moved. Simon stood up, set his knife and wood on the porch railing and walked down the steps. He was not sure why. Later, he would think about it and not arrive at a satisfying answer. Maybe it was the way she had asked, which was the way a person asks who is capable of handling the problem themselves and is simply requesting assistance as a matter of efficiency. Maybe it was that nobody else was moving, and his legs made the decision before his brain caught up. Maybe it was the mule named Biscuit, who was looking at Simon with large, philosophical eyes that seemed to say someone ought to do something. "I can fix it," Simon said. She turned those brown eyes on him, and he felt something shift, very small and very deep, the way a floorboard shifts in a house that's been still a long time. "Good," she said. "I have a spare wheel in the back. My name is Henrietta Thatcher. I've come from St. Louis by train to Wichita and by wagon from Wichita, and I've got a land claim filed with the county for 160 acres about 8 miles southeast of this town, and I intend to build a farm on it." Simon blinked once. "Simon Turner," he said. "Mr. Turner," she said, and stuck out her hand. He shook it. Her grip was firm. "The spare wheel is wrapped in canvas behind the supply crates," she said, already moving to the back of the wagon. He followed her. They worked on the wheel together in the market square while the rest of Caldwell went back to its business, though several people found reasons to linger nearby. Henrietta handed him tools with the efficiency of someone who had at least watched a wheel be changed before, and she did not chatter, but she did not go silent either. She told him facts while he worked. She told him she had bought the land claim from a man in St. Louis, who had decided Kansas was not for him. She told him the land was listed as having a seasonal creek and 30 acres of workable soil, along with pasture enough for a modest cattle operation. She told him she had capital saved. She used the word capital without any self-consciousness, from 6 years of working as a school teacher, and saving nearly every cent while living in her cousin's house. She told him she planned to start with a vegetable garden and chickens, because those could sustain her while she built toward cattle, and she had already arranged to purchase a milk cow from a farmer outside Wichita. She said all of this in a steady, factual way, as if she were reading from a plan she had memorized, which Simon suspected she had. "You're going out there alone?" he asked, lifting the broken wheel free. "I am going out there," she said. "Whether alone or not remains to be seen. It's not easy country. I did not come to Kansas because I thought it would be easy." Simon looked at her over the wagon bed. She met his gaze straight on. "Fair enough," he said. He fitted the spare wheel, checked the axle, pronounced it sound. She thanked him with a directness that carried genuine warmth but no excess, paid him 50 cents for his time without him asking, and told him she would be at the hotel tonight and leaving for the claim in the morning. He watched her drive the wagon toward Haverson's to buy supplies, Biscuit the mule moving with a resigned dignity. Then he picked up his wood and his knife and stood there on the porch holding them, and the whittling did not seem particularly interesting anymore. That evening he was in the saloon, not drinking heavily, just sitting with a beer going warm when she came in. Women did not generally come into Denny Pitt's saloon, which was a rougher establishment than the hotel dining room. But Henrietta Thatcher came in because, as Simon would later understand, she went where she needed to go and simply dealt with whatever complications arose from that. She looked around the room until she found him, then walked over with the directness she seemed to apply to everything and pulled out the chair across from him. "I have a proposal," she said. "You've known me 6 hours," Simon said. "I know enough," she said, which should have sounded presumptuous but instead sounded like a reasonable statement of fact. "I need help building a house, not a grand house. A solid one-room structure to start, with a good roof and a proper floor. I need help breaking the first 2 acres of soil for planting. I need help putting up a fence line for the livestock. I can pay wages, not generous wages but fair ones. $3 a week plus meals and I'll make your accommodation in the barn sound enough. I need someone who knows land work and can be trusted. And in this town in the past 6 hours, you are the only man who fits both of those requirements." Simon studied his beer. "Most men would say no," he said. "Most men have things keeping them here," she said. "You do not look to me like a man who has things keeping him anywhere." It was not said cruelly. It was said with the same honest precision she applied to wheel axles and land claims, and it landed in Simon's chest with a weight that surprised him, not because it stung, but because it was true, and he had not heard the truth about himself said plainly in a very long time. $3 a week," he said, "plus meals and a dry place to sleep. Your meals or mine. I am a competent cook," she said with just enough indignation to be human. He almost smiled. He caught it before it arrived. When do you want to leave? Sun up, she said. I'll have Cobb ready. She stood, started to go, then turned back. Mr. Turner, I want you to know that I am not the sort of person who asks for help lightly. I've thought this through carefully. I'm asking because I genuinely think I can make something real out there, and I would rather build it right than build it fast and alone and have it fall down. He looked at her for a long moment. In the lamplight of the saloon, with the noise of other men's conversations around them, she looked very determined and also, though she would have hated him for noticing, slightly uncertain, the way anyone looks when they've committed to something enormous and are standing on the edge of it. I'll be ready at sunup, he said. She nodded and walked out. Simon sat with his warm beer for another hour, trying to identify exactly what he was feeling, and when he finally went upstairs to his room, he packed his saddlebag with more care than he had in a long time. The morning was pale gold and cold when they set out, Henrietta driving the wagon and Simon riding Cobb beside it. The Kansas plains opened around them as they left Caldwell, vast and flat and blue-green with the beginning of spring grass, the sky enormous overhead. Simon had ridden this land 100 times and never paid it much attention, but now with someone beside him who was looking at it like she was reading a promise, he found himself looking too. They did not talk much the first hour. The land spread itself out in long, quiet miles. A hawk circled above a stand of cottonwoods near a creek bed. The wagon creaked. Biscuit snorted at intervals that seemed philosophical. Have you worked land before? Henrietta asked eventually. Some, Simon said. Worked the Hennessy spread for 3 seasons before they brought in their own crew. Did some homesteading with my father when I was young. It didn't take. What happened? Simon was quiet for a moment. He gave up, he said finally. Bad seasons, grasshoppers in 74. After that he lost his interest in trying. Henrietta was quiet a moment. I'm sorry, she said. And it was the kind of sorry that meant she had heard the thing underneath the words, the part that wasn't about grasshoppers at all. It was a long time ago, Simon said. She let it rest. He appreciated that. The land claim lay 8 miles southeast as promised, and when they reached it, Simon could see immediately that she had bought reasonably. The claim sat along a gentle rise that sloped down toward the creek she'd mentioned, which was running clear and steady with spring water. The grass was good. There was a stand of cottonwood and cedar along the eastern edge that would provide lumber and some wind protection. 30 workable acres along the creek bottom looked as advertised, dark and rich. There was nothing built on it, no structure at all, just land. Henrietta climbed down from the wagon and walked out into the middle of the open ground and turned a slow circle, taking it all in, and her face in that moment was so quietly and completely alive with something, not happiness exactly, but the specific light of a person who has arrived somewhere they have been moving toward for a very long time, that Simon looked away from it, because it felt too private to watch. Right, she said, pulling herself back to the practical with visible effort. I want the house here, facing south, to catch the light. 20 feet by 16 to start. We can add a room later if we need to. We'll need to cut timber from the creek stand, Simon said, studying the cottonwoods. We've got enough for the frame and floor joists. The walls will need sod unless you've got money for milled lumber freighted in. I'd rather have sod and keep the capital for seed and livestock, she said. Can you build with sod? Soddy walls hold heat better in winter anyway, he said. I know how it's done. She pulled a folded paper from her coat pocket and showed him her hand-drawn plan for the house. It was neat and specific, with measurements and notations. He studied it, made 2 small suggestions about the placement of the door relative to the prevailing wind, and she listened and revised the drawing on the spot. They set up camp that first day, using the wagon as shelter and getting the fire going. Henrietta cooked salt pork and cornbread in a cast iron pan, and it was in fact very good, which Simon noted without comment. She had organized her supply crates with a precision that would have impressed a quartermaster sergeant. Every item had its place and its purpose. Over the next several weeks, Simon Turner learned things about Henrietta Thatcher that he had not expected and could not ignore. He learned that she rose before dawn every single day, not because she forced herself, but because she was genuinely eager to begin. He would hear her moving before the sky had any color, stoking the fire, feeding Biscuit, talking quietly to the milk cow. She'd named Margaret, who had arrived on the third day via a farmer from Wichita who'd brought her out for a fair price. Henrietta talked to the animals conversationally, not baby talk, but actual conversation, as if she found them reasonable enough company for the early hours. Simon caught himself listening to this from his bedroll before he got up, and told himself it was simply that the sound helped him orient himself before opening his eyes. He learned that she kept a small journal in the evenings, writing in it by firelight with a thoroughness that suggested she was recording everything. Not just what she'd done, but what she'd thought about. She never told him what she wrote. He never asked. But he noticed the journal, noticed how her face went soft and private when she wrote in it, noticed that the writing seemed to ease something in her at the end of long, hard days. He learned that she had come from difficult circumstances herself, though she spoke of it without self-pity. Her father had died when she was 14, leaving her mother and 3 younger siblings in a small house in St. Louis with limited means. Henrietta had started working as a teacher's assistant at 16 and taken a full classroom at 18. She had given money home for years. Her youngest brother was now 16 and working, her sisters both married. Her mother was in better circumstances. Henrietta had finally, at 26, turned her savings toward the thing she'd been thinking about since she was a girl reading about homestead land out west. "You wanted land your whole life?" Simon asked one evening. They were sitting by the fire outside what was becoming, with each passing day, the visible skeleton of a house. "I wanted something that was mine," she said. "Something I'd built and that would be there when I woke up every morning, real and solid." She paused. "Does that sound strange?" "No," Simon said. "It sounds like you understood something." She looked at him. "What did you understand?" she asked, and her tone was genuinely curious, not challenging. Simon looked at the fire. "That things fall apart," he said. "I understood that early. I suppose I concluded from it that building things was a waste of time." The words surprised him by coming out. He hadn't said that particular thought aloud before, maybe hadn't even formed it that clearly in his own mind. It sat between them in the firelight, honest and a little raw. Henrietta didn't rush to answer. She looked at the half-built house frame behind him. "I came to a different conclusion from the same fact," she said quietly. "I decided it was better to have built something that fell apart than to have built nothing at all. At least you had it while it stood." Simon had nothing to say to that. He looked at the fire for a long time. The house progressed day by day with the steady, physical rhythm that Simon had always found easier than thinking. They cut timber together, Simon swinging the axe in long, steady strokes while Henrietta trimmed limbs and hauled sections to the building site. She did not stand back and direct. She worked beside him in the dirt and the sweat and the splinters, which he respected without saying so. He cut and hauled sod blocks from the prairie, heavy rectangular bricks of matted root and dark earth, and stacked them in courses for the walls with the methodical patience the work required. Henrietta learned quickly how to lay them, overlapping the courses like brickwork, and after the first day her lines were straighter than his. He told her so. She accepted the compliment without false modesty. The roof gave them the most trouble. It was the first week of April, and the weather was still unpredictable. They had a partial roof frame up when a late storm rolled in from the northwest, with the particular sudden violence that Kansas reserves for late winter, all hard wind and horizontal sleet. They worked by lantern in the dark for 2 hours, nailing the canvas, sheeting down over the frame to protect the sod walls from softening in the rain. And by the time they got inside the partially built structure and out of the worst of it, they were both soaked through and shaking with cold. Henrietta built a fire in the stove they'd set up in the corner. The iron stove was her one real luxury, hauled from Caldwell, and they stood close to it while the storm hammered outside, and the walls, which were sod and not much else, held the warmth in a way that surprised Simon. "Sod has its advantages," Henrietta said, through chattering teeth. Told you, Simon said. She laughed. It was the first time he'd heard her laugh properly, not the small polite acknowledgement of something mildly amusing, but a real laugh, warm and real and unguarded, and it lit her whole face. Simon felt it hit him somewhere specific and tried to determine where exactly and then stopped trying. You're going to get sick if you stay wet, he said, which was a practical observation and also a way of saying something else, though he could not have said what. So are you, she pointed out. They each turned their backs and changed into dry clothes from their respective packs. They had, from the beginning, maintained the unspoken boundary of their arrangement with a mutual respect that never needed to be named. And when they turned back to the fire, she had a pot of coffee going and he had added wood. And they sat in the warm sod room while the storm raged outside. And for the first time in a very long time, Simon Turner did not feel the particular weight of silence pressing on him. They talked for hours that night, not about anything that seemed important at the time, about St. Louis and what it was like and how it smelled, which was apparently not pleasant near the river, about the Kishom Trail and the cattle drives he'd ridden as a young man before he'd gotten out of that line of work, about books she'd read and the fact that he hadn't read nearly enough, which she said with a tone that suggested this was a remediable situation. She had brought 7 books with her in a wooden crate, which he thought was both impractical and exactly right. She made him promise to read one, and he said he'd consider it, and she produced a copy of a worn collection of essays by Ralph Waldo Emerson and put it in his hands with the same directness she applied to everything. He read the first essay by firelight while the storm went on. She read one of her other books across from him, a novel. The fire crackled. The walls held. Outside, the prairie was being washed clean. At some point, Henrietta fell asleep in her chair, the book still open in her lap, her head tilted to one side. Simon looked at her for a moment, then very quietly took his blanket roll and went asleep on the floor on his side of the room, and lay awake for a while listening to the rain and thinking about things that had no clear resolution, which was a new experience, because for several years he had not been in the habit of thinking about things that had any future possibility in them at all. May came in warm and full of green. The house was finished by the 5th of the month, roof sealed with a layer of sod over the timber frame and the canvas beneath, door hung straight, window cut and fitted with the glass Henrietta had brought from Wichita, which Simon had thought extravagant until he saw what the light did coming through it in the morning. A real wood floor finished smooth. The stove properly vented. A loft above for storage. Henrietta stood in the door of the finished house on the day they declared it done and looked around the interior with an expression Simon had no word for. It was not triumphant. It was deeper than that. It was the look of someone who had believed something for a long time and was now standing inside the proof of it. It's good, Simon said. It's mine, she said, and her voice was very quiet and not entirely steady. He thought about the night she'd said she wanted something of her own, something real and solid. He understood now in a way he hadn't then. This was not just a house. This was the first physical manifestation of an argument she had been making to herself and the world for years. The argument that she could do it, that the life she was working toward was real and possible and worth the cost of it. It's good work, he said, meaning both the house and the person who had pushed it into being. She turned and looked at him, and there was a warmth in her face that was new and unguarded, and she said, I could not have done this without you, Simon. It was the first time she'd used his first name. He stood in the door of the house they'd built together in the Kansas spring and felt something inside him, something that had been shut and bolted for a very long time, click quietly open. He said nothing. She didn't seem to require him to. They planted the garden together the following week, turning the creek-bottom soil with a plow Simon borrowed from a neighboring homesteader named August Beck, whose claim sat 3 miles north and who had been out twice to introduce himself in the way of new country neighbors, which was to show up with something useful and not stay too long. August was a German immigrant in his 40s, solid and direct, and Simon appreciated his manner. Henrietta made him coffee, and they talked about the soil and the weather, and he told her she had bought a good piece of ground. "You'll want to watch the creek in a bad rain season," August said. "She comes up fast." "I'll keep that in mind," Henrietta said. Simon watched her absorb information from every source she could find with the same thoroughness she brought to everything, her head tipped slightly forward, listening with her whole attention. He watched her ask questions that showed she'd already thought about the subject and was looking for the gaps in her understanding. He watched her thank people in a way that was genuinely warm rather than performative. He watched her do all of this while simultaneously managing the physical realities of the farm, the planting, the animals, the maintenance of the house without complaint and without any reduction of standard. She was, he thought one afternoon in the garden, the most fully realized person he had ever spent sustained time with. She knew who she was and what she wanted and why, and all three things lined up cleanly, and watching it was like watching something extremely well-made function the way it was supposed to. He dug potatoes out of the turned earth and thought about the fact that he had hired on for $3 a week and meals and a sleeping space in the barn, and that after 2 months he had asked for no wages at all, and she had noticed this and brought it up once, and he had told her to put it toward the seed fund. And she had studied him for a long moment, and then said thank you in a tone that meant she understood it was not about the money, and she did not know quite yet what it was about, but she was noting it. He was not sure himself what it was about. He told himself it was that the work was satisfying in a way he'd forgotten work could be. He told himself it was that he was well-fed and warm and had more structure to his days than he'd had in years. Both of these things were true. Neither of them was the whole truth. The whole truth was arriving slowly, the way the Kansas spring arrived, not all at once but in accumulated days of warmth and light until you looked up one morning and it was undeniable. He was in love with Henrietta Thatcher. He had been for some time. He had simply been the last person in his own vicinity to receive this information. He sat with it for several days without doing anything about it, which was characteristic of Simon Turner, and which was also, he recognized dimly, a failure of nerve. He would think about saying something and then think of 30 reasons why it was inappropriate or premature or unlikely to be welcome, and then he would go drive a fence post into the ground with excessive force and feel temporarily better. The fence was coming along well. He had been putting up the perimeter fence around the pasture ground for 2 weeks, and it was honest work, the kind that sorted his thoughts if not his heart. Henrietta came out one afternoon in late May with 2 tin mugs of coffee and sat on the fence rail he'd just set and watched him work, and this was not unusual. They had fallen into a habit of company during work breaks, and he took the coffee and leaned on the rail post and they looked out at the pasture together. "I've been thinking about buying 2 cows," she said. "Not dairy, beef cattle, start a small herd." "The grass will support it," Simon said. "You'd want to wait for the pasture fence to be done. That's why I'm telling you now," she said, smiling slightly, "so you'll know there's urgency. Are you calling me slow?" "I am noting that 2 more fence posts a day would not be incompatible with human ability." He looked at her over the coffee mug, and she looked back with that smile that had become increasingly difficult to look at for extended periods, and he thought, very clearly and simply, that he should tell her. He opened his mouth. He said, "Henrietta." Something in his voice must have carried a different weight than usual, because her expression shifted, not alarmed, but attentive in a new way, looking at him carefully. "I want to say something," he said, "and I'm not certain how to say it without it changing things in ways I don't want it to change if you don't." He stopped, because he was making a mess of it. He looked at the pasture. He looked at the half-built fence. He looked at his own hands around the coffee mug. "Simon," she said, and her voice was very even and careful. "I don't want to still be a hired hand," he said. I'm saying it badly." "Say it however it comes out," she said quietly. He looked at her. "I came out here with no intention of caring about anything," he said. I'd gotten quite settled into not caring. I was good at it. And then you hired me to help you build something, and I have spent every day since then caring about every piece of it. And I think a significant portion of that is not about the farm. The Kansas wind moved through the spring grass. A meadowlark called from somewhere in the cottonwoods. Henrietta was quiet for a long moment. Her hands were wrapped around her mug and her eyes were on the middle distance, and he could not read her expression, which was new, because he had learned to read her expressions fairly well. "I've been thinking about it too," she said finally, and it came out with a quiet carefulness that told him this was also true for her, that she had also been sitting with something. "I've been thinking about whether it's real or whether it's because we're building something together, and that creates a closeness that might not be what it seems." "That's a fair thing to wonder," Simon said. "And I think," she said, still looking at the pasture, "that I have been using that question as a way to avoid answering a different one." "Which is?" She turned and looked at him directly, and her eyes were steady and honest in the way all of her was steady and honest. "Whether I want you to be here not because I hired you but because you want to be here. Whether what I feel when you walk into a room is an appropriate professional appreciation or something considerably more significant." "Is it the second one?" he asked, and his voice came out quieter than he intended. "Yes," she said, "it is definitely the second one." They sat on the fence rail in the late afternoon light with the meadowlark still singing and the Kansas sky enormous above them. And Simon put his hand over hers where it rested on the rail, and she turned her hand over and held his. And that was how it began, without any further ceremony, which seemed right for both of them. He kissed her that evening. They had finished supper and were standing outside in the blue dusk after she'd gone in and come out again with the Emerson book to return to him. She had borrowed it after he'd left it sitting open one night, and as she handed it to him, their hands met on the spine of the book and neither of them moved to let go. And Simon looked at her face in the soft evening light and thought he had been waiting for this particular moment without knowing he was waiting, and he leaned in and kissed her, gently and briefly, and pulled back to look at her. She looked at him for a moment with wide, bright eyes, and then said, "You might do that again." And so he did, longer this time, and she kissed him back with a warmth and a thoroughness that was entirely Henrietta. They stood in the blue dusk of the Kansas evening with the first stars coming out above the prairie, and Simon Turner, who had told himself for years that he had no reason to build anything, felt the ground shift under his feet into something that felt, strangely and enormously, like foundation. The summer of 1879 moved over the Kansas plains with a heat that shimmered and roared. They planted corn and potatoes and a kitchen garden of cabbages and beans and squash, and they argued cheerfully about where to put the root cellar, and Henrietta won, and the root cellar went in the spot she'd chosen and turned out to be correct. Simon built a proper chicken coop from timber and wire, 12 hens and a rooster who had an inflated opinion of himself. The milk cow Margaret was joined by 2 young beef cattle Henrietta bought from a drover who came through in June, a lean red and a brindle, both good stock, and she knew enough about cattle by now to tell the difference. They rode into Caldwell together on Saturdays for supplies and post, and the town took note. Towns always take note. Mrs. Haverson at the general store was warmly approving. Denny Pitts, who still occasionally ran into Simon, raised his eyebrows in a way that was not unkind. August Beck, when he came by in early July to help Simon with a new corral section, shook his hand and nodded at Henrietta in a way that expressed everything without a word. There was also a man named Walter Grimes who made things briefly difficult. Grimes was a land speculator out of Wichita, a heavy-set man in his 40s with a business manner that did not quite cover a harder one underneath. He arrived in late June driving a smart buggy and presented himself as a buyer, telling Henrietta that her land claim was better situated than she probably knew and that he was prepared to offer her a fair price for it. Henrietta listened to his entire presentation politely and then told him she was not interested in selling, He came back a week later with a higher figure and a tone that had acquired an edge. He said he had connections with the county land office and could make certain adjustments to her claim, filing very difficult if she was unreasonable about this. Simon was there for this conversation, and he stepped forward and said quietly, but with a clarity that Grimes clearly understood, that any adjustments to Mrs. Thatcher's claim that were not in order would be a matter for the county sheriff, and that the county sheriff was a man named Henderson, who Simon had ridden fence line with for a summer, and who was not a man to be trifled with. Grimes looked at Simon for a long calculating moment, then got back in his buggy and drove away, and did not return. Henrietta thanked Simon that evening. "He won't come back," Simon said. "I hope you're right," she said, "but if he does, I will handle it myself. I want you to know that." "I know that," Simon said. "I just happened to be standing there." "You happen to be standing there with a very particular expression," she said, with a slight smile. "What expression?" "The one that says you are a man who is willing to be very patient about something if necessary," she said. "It's actually one of the most effective expressions I've ever seen." Simon looked at her. "When have you been studying my expressions?" "For several months," she said, without any embarrassment about it whatsoever. He pulled her in by the hand and kissed her, and she put her hands on his chest and kissed him back. And outside, the midsummer Kansas light went golden over the crops they had planted together, and Simon thought that the thing inside him that had clicked open back in the spring was not clicking shut again, and he was glad. It was in July, on an evening when the heat had finally broken and there was a soft wind coming from the north, that the deeper conversation happened. They were sitting on the steps of the house, Henrietta with her journal and Simon with a second book she'd given him, a history of the frontier territories that he'd found genuinely absorbing. The stars were tremendous. Kansas stars in summer were not something a person got used to no matter how long they lived beneath them. "Can I ask you something?" Henrietta said, setting down her journal. "Yes," Simon said, which was a thing he would not have said to many people with that level of unconditionality. "What do you want?" she asked. "Not for the farm, not practically. What do you want for yourself, for your life going forward?" Simon was quiet. He watched a shooting star trace across the south sky and vanish. "I've been not answering that question for a long time," he said finally. "I got used to not having an answer for it. And now," he looked at her. In the starlight she was very beautiful, not in a way he thought about decoratively, but in the deeper way a person is beautiful when you know them from the inside, when their face has become a landscape you recognize and love. "Now I think I've been answering it without saying so," he said slowly. "Every post I've driven and every wall I've built and every morning I've gotten up before the sun because there was something worth getting up for, I think that's been an answer." Henrietta was still, listening. "I want to stay," he said. "I want to stop being a man who doesn't have reasons to stay anywhere. I want to be a man who helps build something real." If he stopped and started again. "I'm not a man who has much to offer by way of material things. I have Cobb and my rifle and what's in my saddlebag. I have the work in my hands and whatever's in my character, which is a mixed account. But I want to be here. I want to be here with you." The wind moved through the corn they had planted, and the sound of it was green and full. Henrietta closed her journal and turned to face him fully. "I want to tell you something," she said. "When I left St. Louis, when I got on that train, I was not looking for a person. I was looking for land. I had made a specific decision to put everything I had into building this farm and to not be distracted from it by wanting a person when I couldn't afford the vulnerability of needing someone who might not stay." "That's a reasonable position," Simon said. "It was a very sensible position," she agreed. "And then you fixed my wagon wheel." He looked at her and almost said something, but she continued. "And I watched you build walls," she said. "I watched you work with the kind of attention and care that a person brings to something they're invested in, even when you were telling yourself you weren't invested. I watched you read that Emerson essay by firelight and get annoyed with it in a way that meant you were genuinely engaging with it. I watched you talk to Biscuit in the mornings." She paused. "Biscuit likes you considerably." "Biscuit is a very poor judge of character," Simon said. "Biscuit is an excellent judge of character," she said firmly. "And I watched you stand between me and Walter Grimes not with aggression but with the particular quietness of a man who will not be moved, and I thought," her voice softened, "I thought that this is a man who can be trusted with the things that matter, and the things that matter to me now include you." Simon took her hand. She held it. "Henrietta," he said, "I want to ask you to marry me, and I want to do it properly, and I want you to know that the question is serious and permanent and not subject to revision." She was very still. "I know it's not the most conventional proposal," he said. "I don't have a ring. I don't have a family to introduce you to or a house to offer you, because you already have a better house than I could have built without you. I don't have a name that means much in this territory or any territory. What I have is that I love you genuinely and without reservation, and that has not happened to me before, and I do not expect it to happen again, and I intend to spend whatever years I have being worth the trust you put in me." Henrietta looked at him for a long time, and her brown eyes were very bright. "Simon Turner," she said, "I've been waiting for you to ask me that for 3 weeks. 3 weeks," he said. "You are occasionally slow," she said. "You told me that about the fence posts." "The fence posts and apparently also this," she said, and she was laughing and crying slightly at the same time in a way that was not like her and was also perfectly her. And he put his arms around her on the steps of the house they'd built together under the Kansas stars, and she leaned into him with a fullness and a trust that told him she had made the decision absolutely, not out of sentiment, but out of the same careful, clear-eyed certainty she brought to every decision. "Yes," she said against his shoulder, "that is my answer, yes." They were married in September of 1879 in the Caldwell church, which was a modest white frame building that had been standing for 5 years and served as the primary venue for everything meaningful the town conducted. Reverend Horace Calthorpe, a thin man with kind eyes and an unhurried manner, performed the ceremony. August Beck stood up for Simon, having accepted the role with a gruff sincerity that Simon found deeply moving. A woman named Clara Dunbar, who ran the millinery in Caldwell, and who had taken Henrietta under her wing with a warmth that Henrietta had accepted with characteristic matter-of-factness, stood up for Henrietta. The church was full, because Caldwell was not a large town and a wedding was a proper occasion. Henrietta wore a dress she and Clara had made together from a green-gray wool that was the color of Kansas grass in late summer, and she wore her hair pinned up with a small spray of dried wildflowers that she had pressed herself in the pages of the Emerson book, which Simon found out about and thought about for a long time. She walked down the aisle with her chin up and her eyes on him, and Simon stood at the front of the church and thought he would remember exactly what she looked like at that moment for the rest of his life, and he was right. He had, with a month's wages from a fortnight of work at the Hennessy Ranch, bought a simple gold ring from a jeweler in Wichita who traveled through Caldwell. It was not elaborate. Henrietta put it on her finger and looked at it with more feeling than the jeweler had probably expected any customer to show. After the ceremony, there was a gathering at the church hall, with food contributed by half the town and music from a fiddler named Amos who played until the candles were low. Simon danced with Henrietta twice, which was notable because Simon Turner had never in his life previously admitted to being able to dance. He was not graceful, but he was attentive, and he held her carefully and she rested her hand on his shoulder and they moved together in the candlelight and she tipped her face up at him and he looked down at her and the music and the other people fell entirely away for a moment. "You are dancing," she said. "I am making a reasonable attempt at it," he said. "It's the best dancing I've ever seen," she said. "You've seen a lot of dancing." "I've seen enough to know what I like," she said, and the warmth in her voice wrapped around him like the warm sod walls of their house. They rode back to the farm under a September moon that turned the prairie silver, Henrietta beside him on the wagon seat with her shoulder against his. Cobb followed tied behind, and Biscuit pulled with his usual resigned dignity. The corn had been brought in by then, the root cellar full, the hay stacked. The farm was going into its first winter in a state of solid readiness, and Simon felt something he had not felt in so long that he had to search for the word. Safe. he felt safe. Not from anything external, from the inside, from the particular loneliness of a person who has no one to account to and no one to come home to. He was home. He was coming home. The winter of 1879 into 1880 was a working winter, not hard in the way the plains winters could be, but cold and sustained. And the soddy house was warm and the stove did its work, and they moved through the short days with an ease of cohabitation that neither of them had to think about. It was simply there. They read in the evenings, the lamp between them, sometimes reading aloud to each other. They played cards with the hand-painted deck Henrietta had brought from St. Louis. They talked about the plans for spring, more acreage broken for corn, a second milk cow, a proper well rather than the hauled water they'd been managing. Simon made a set of shelves for the kitchen wall from some of the remaining cedar timber, fitting them with a carpenter's precision. Henrietta put her 7 books on them, and the clay jug she'd brought from St. Louis that had been her mother's. Looking at it made her quiet for a day, and Simon did not press but made sure the coffee was hot and the house was warm and was present in the specific way he had learned she needed, which was close but not hovering. She wrote her mother a long letter that winter and received one back by spring that made her cry happy tears at the kitchen table. Her mother was well. Her youngest brother James had gotten a good job with a railroad company in St. Louis. Both sisters sent their love. "I want them to come see this," Henrietta said, looking out the window at the Kansas winter sky. "I want them to see what I've built." "They will," Simon said. "Will you be all right with that?" she asked. "With family here?" He had been pouring coffee and he stopped and turned to look at her, and she was looking at him with a gentle attentiveness, asking the real question underneath the practical one. "Yes," he said. "I'll be more than all right." She held his gaze for a moment, then nodded. "Good," she said quietly, and there was something that closed in the word, something that had been waiting to close, about the fact of who he was and what he'd lost, and whether he could receive this kind of thing without it frightening him away. And the answer was yes. He was staying. He was absolutely staying. Spring came back to the claim with a rush. April ran warm and wet, and the creek came up exactly as August Beck had warned. And Simon spent 3 hard days reinforcing the bank with cut timber and packed earth to keep the bottom field from flooding. And it worked. And Henrietta stood at the edge of the field in her canvas coat and said, "Good work," in a tone of such clear satisfaction that Simon felt it in his bones. The second year's planting was larger and more confident. They broke 8 more acres, enough for a proper corn crop and expanded vegetables. The 2 beef cattle from the previous year were joined by 2 more, a young heifer and a bull calf they could raise out. The chickens had proliferated to 18, which was more chickens than anyone strictly needed, but which produced eggs in such satisfying quantity that Henrietta had begun selling them in Caldwell on market days. Simon took on no outside work now. He was entirely a farmer, Henrietta's husband, a partner in something that had grown specific and real enough to have its own weight and gravity. He still woke some mornings with the old hollow feeling, the echo of a life that had been about nothing and going nowhere, and on those mornings he would lie still and listen to the sounds of the farm, the rooster, the cattle shifting in the corral, Henrietta's footsteps on the wood floor, and the hollow feeling would recede, slowly but completely, the way the darkness recedes when light comes into a room. He was a husband. He was building something. He realized one morning in May while he was mending harness in the morning sun, happy. Quietly, durably, without drama or the need to announce itself. Happy. In June of 1880, Henrietta told him she was expecting. She told him at breakfast in the same direct way she told him most things, looking up from her coffee with that expression he now knew was her serious face, the one that carried something important. "I believe we are going to have a child," she said. "By my counting, sometime in February." Simon set down his fork. She watched him carefully. "February," he said. "Give or take a few weeks," she said. He looked at her for a moment, and he thought about his own father who had given up, and his brother Cole, who was gone, and his mother who had died young, and all the family that had come apart around him in his life, and he thought about Henrietta, who built things and kept them standing. And he felt something tremendous and entirely new move through him, something that had no prior reference in his experience. He got up and went around the table and crouched down beside her chair and took her hands and looked up at her face. "Henrietta," he said. "Yes," she said very carefully. "I am so glad," he said. "I am profoundly, completely glad." She let out a breath she had perhaps been holding, and her face broke open into that full, warm smile, and she brought his hands up and pressed them against her heart and said, "So am I, Simon. So am I." August Beck and his wife, Marta, came to call that summer when the news had become obvious, and Marta Beck, who was stout and warm and had 5 children of her own, took Henrietta's hands and said things in German that needed no translation. She came back regularly through the fall, bringing provisions and advice and company, and Henrietta received all 3 with gratitude. Clara Dunbar from Caldwell came out twice as well. The small community that had formed around them, August and Marta, Clara, Reverend Calthorpe and his wife who visited in October, was a real thing, a web of connection and mutual care that Simon observed with a feeling that was partly wonder and partly something that felt like grief's opposite. This was what you built when you built, not just walls and fields but this. Henrietta's mother, Ellen Thatcher, arrived by train and wagon in October, a small, vigorous woman in her mid-50s with Henrietta's jaw and Henrietta's eyes, and a way of looking at things that assessed their value with quiet accuracy. She looked at the farm when she arrived and at Simon standing beside it, and her assessment was clearly visible in her expression and clearly positive, which relieved Simon more than he would have admitted. Ellen stayed 3 weeks. She worked hard, helped put up the autumn preserves and the final round of root vegetables into the cellar, sat with Henrietta in the evenings and talked. Simon gave them their evenings and went to read in the barn on a chair he'd put there, not because he was unwelcome, but because some things between mothers and daughters are their own weather. One afternoon near the end of Ellen's visit, he was splitting firewood and she came out to talk to him directly, in the manner he recognized as a family trait. "My daughter is the most determined person I have raised," Ellen said. "Yes, ma'am," Simon said. "She has been determined since she was 4 years old and decided she knew better than the creek how to flow," Ellen said. "She is not easy. She will tell you what she thinks. She will work harder than you on most days and she will expect the same from you." "I know," Simon said. "She loves you very much," Ellen said. "I can see that she does, and I know her. She does not love anything partway." Simon stopped splitting wood and looked at Ellen Thatcher. "I know that too," he said. "I know it and I don't take it lightly." Ellen studied him for a moment with those assessing eyes. "No," she said. "I can see that you don't." And that was the end of the conversation, and she went back inside, and Simon went on splitting wood with the particular satisfaction of a man who has passed an important examination. The winter of 1880 was harder than the previous one. Cold came down from the north in January, with a ferocity that kept them inside for days at a stretch, maintaining the livestock and the house and each other through the white stillness. Henrietta was large with the baby now and moved with a careful deliberateness, and Simon was close and attentive without being smothering, having paid enough attention to her over a year and a half to know where the line was. He read to her in the evenings, having become genuinely fond of reading, which was a transformation he acknowledged privately as one of the more unexpected developments of his life. He had worked through all 7 of her books, and she had ordered 4 more from a bookshop in Wichita, and they debated the contents with a vigor that sometimes surprised both of them, and was one of the genuine pleasures of Simon's daily existence. On the 12th of February, 1881, Henrietta went into labor in the small house with Marta Beck attending, who had driven out from the Beck claim in the cold with her bag of provisions and her 5 deliveries of experience and her warm, competent hands. Simon was outside for most of it in the way of the time and the necessity of his own sanity, working the horses and the cattle and stopping to listen at the door at intervals. And when the sound of a new voice came through the wood, thin and indignant and very much alive, he sat down on the step in the February cold and pressed his face into his hands. Marta let him in after a few minutes. Henrietta was propped up in the bed with color in her face and exhaustion around her eyes and their son in her arms. Their son. Simon came and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the child and then at his wife, and Henrietta looked back at him with an expression of complete and utter wonder. "He has your eyes," she said. Simon looked at the tiny red face. The eyes were still unfocused, and the face bore no particular resemblance to anything, but Simon was not going to argue about the eyes. "He's perfect," Simon said, which was the only true and sufficient thing. "What do we call him?" Henrietta asked. They had discussed names but not settled. Simon looked at his son and thought about the men he'd known who had been worth naming a person after. He thought about the fact that his own father's name was a weight he didn't want to carry over. He thought about one particular person. "Cole," he said, "if you don't mind it." Henrietta looked at him gently. "After your brother," she said. "He deserved better than he got," Simon said. "I'd like to give the name a better run." Henrietta touched his face with her free hand. "Cole Turner," she said, and the name sounded right and whole and new. "That's a very good name." Cole Turner arrived into the world in February 1881 and immediately established himself as an interested and opinionated person, which surprised neither of his parents. He slept in the cradle Simon had built over the winter from cedar wood, smoothed and finished with a care that went beyond practical requirement, and he watched the world from it with wide gray eyes that would eventually, in his second year, settle into the particular blue-gray of his father's. Life on the farm continued with the addition of Cole, larger and more complicated and noisier, and more saturated with meaning. Henrietta recovered with the practical speed characteristic of her, was back at light chores within a week, was back at most things within 3, and was doing full work within 2 months with Cole strapped to her front in the flannel carrier that Marta Beck had shown her how to make, working the garden and talking to Cole about the plants the way she talked to the animals, as if sharing information with him was simply a normal and reasonable thing to do. Simon watched this and felt the accumulated weight of a particular understanding pressing on him. The understanding that family was not something that happened to you but something that you built, the same as a house, the same as a farm, one deliberate piece at a time, with care and effort and the willingness to be present for it. He had believed for years that family was a thing that got taken away. He had organized his life around the fact of its absence. And now he stood in the May morning on his own farm with his wife in the field below, and his son making conversational sounds against her chest, and the fields running green in the morning light, and the cattle moving in the corral, and the chickens in their coop, and August Beck's place a visible point of smoke 3 miles north, and the house he'd built with his own hands sitting solid and permanent on the Kansas earth. And he thought, this is what the opposite of falling apart looks like. The spring and summer of 1881 opened fully and generously. The corn came up thick and even. They added 4 more beef cattle in June, bringing the herd to 8, which was the beginning of something real. Simon built a second corral section and improved the barn with better roof timber, and he and August Beck traded labor on several fence sections, which was the frontier economy at its most practical and satisfying. One Saturday in July, they rode into Caldwell for supplies and post, Henrietta holding Cole in her arms on the wagon seat while Simon drove. Cole had developed by now into a person with opinions about the world expressed loudly and without hesitation, and he was currently discussing the horse tied to the post outside Haverson's with a detailed commentary that mostly consisted of repeated enthusiastic sounds. "He's going to be trouble," Simon said. "He's going to be extraordinary," Henrietta said. "Those 2 things can be simultaneous," Simon said. She laughed. Cole laughed at her laughing, which was one of his current best features. Simon looked at the 2 of them and felt something that was past any word he had for it, some fullness that sat in the chest and pressed outward in all directions. In Haverson's store, Mrs. Haverson admired Cole with the thoroughness of a woman who has admired many children and means every word of it. Simon picked up a package that had arrived for Henrietta from St. Louis, from her sister Anna, who had sent fabric and a letter and a small carved wooden horse for Cole that Anna's husband had made. Henrietta read the letter in the store with her cheek against Cole's head and her eyes very bright. "Anna's expecting," she said. "Due in December." "That's good news," Simon said. "Our children will know each other," Henrietta said, and there was a warmth in it, the warmth of a family extending itself across distance, staying connected by choice and affection, and the deliberate effort of writing letters and sending packages. Simon thought of his own brother's letter, the one he'd burned. He thought about what it would mean to have done the opposite. He thought that you could not go back and undo those things, but you could go forward and do them differently, and that was, perhaps, enough. There was a moment in August of that year that Simon would return to for the rest of his life. It was late afternoon, the long golden August light that slants across the Kansas plain and turns everything to something out of a painting. He was mending a section of fence at the north edge of the pasture, and he stopped for some reason and turned, and he could see the whole farm from where he stood. The house sat on its rise, solid and permanent, the sod roof green with a late growth of grass, smoke rising from the chimney where Henrietta would be starting supper. The fields ran south from it, the corn tall and close to harvest, the cattle moving in the evening pasture. The barn stood at the east. The vegetable garden spread below the house, heavy and productive. And in the doorway of the house, Henrietta appeared, holding Cole on her hip, and she raised a hand to shade her eyes and looked out across the farm, and when she saw Simon at the fence line she raised her hand in a wave, the simple, ordinary gesture of a woman to her husband across the work of their shared life. Simon raised his hand back. It was nothing. It was everything. It was the smallest exchange, the most ordinary domestic signal, and it landed in him with a force and completeness that no dramatic moment had ever matched, because it was real and his and built, not given or taken but built, stone by stone and day by day. Out of the choice to stay and the choice to be present, and the choice that Henrietta had begun that first morning when she had looked at a broken wagon wheel and decided to ask for help from the one man standing who seemed like he might be worth asking. Fall came in rich and golden. They brought in the largest corn harvest the farm had seen, enough to sell the surplus in Caldwell and bank the money toward a second room on the house, which they had been planning since before Cole arrived, and which was now a pressing practical matter. Simon began the addition in September, building it out from the south wall in proper timber frame construction this time, because they had the means now, and it went up fast and clean through October. Henrietta's mother came again in November, this time with Henrietta's youngest brother James, who was 17 and tall, and looked at the farm with an expression of considerable wonder. James was a good-natured young man with energy to spare, and he worked hard alongside Simon for 2 weeks and they got along well, and Simon showed him things he was genuinely curious about, and James left with a handshake that was warm and real. "He liked it here," Henrietta said, watching the wagon carrying James back toward the Caldwell stage. "He might find his own way to country like this someday," Simon said. "I hope he does," she said. Then she smiled. "I hope he finds someone like you to help him build it." Simon looked at her. "Like me?" "Someone stubborn enough to stay and good enough to be worth staying for," she said simply. He put his arm around her there in the November cold, and she leaned into his side, and they watched the wagon grow small in the distance, and the land lay around them in its autumn colors, amber and brown and gold, and the house behind them had its new room finished, and the stove going warm, and Cole was inside with a pot that he was presumably not supposed to be banging, and Simon held his wife in the Kansas November and thought about what it meant to have answered the question she had asked him. In one form or another since the first day, whether he would help her build something, whether he would show up and do the work, whether he was a man who could choose to stay, he had chosen. Every single day since that first morning, he had chosen, and the choosing had not diminished but accumulated, each day adding its weight to the total until the total was this: the full specific life of Simon Turner, which was a thing he was now entirely glad to own. The winter of 1881 was the quietest they'd had, quiet in the good sense, deep and internal and warm. Cole took his first solid steps in December, lurching between the kitchen table and the new room with an expression of profound concentration and absolute determination that Henrietta noted, with a satisfaction that was almost smug, bore no resemblance whatsoever to his father's approach to new challenges. "He practically ran before he walked," Simon said. "That is not my temperament." "He has my temperament," Henrietta said. "He decided he was going to do it and then did it without excessive deliberation." "I deliberate at appropriate intervals," Simon said. "You deliberated for 3 weeks before proposing to me," she said. "I was being thorough," he said. "You were being a coward," she said pleasantly. "And it turned out fine regardless." Simon did not argue this point, because it was accurate. They spent Christmas with the Becks, the 4 adults and Cole and the 5 Beck children, filling the Beck soddy house with noise and warmth and good food, Marta having produced quantities of German Christmas pastries that were the best things Simon had eaten possibly in his life. August produced a bottle of German brandy and poured it carefully into small glasses, and they toasted the year and the land and their children, and each other with a seriousness that was also very joyful. Riding home through the Christmas night, Cole asleep across Henrietta's lap wrapped in a wool blanket, the stars extraordinary above them, Simon held the reins and felt the cold and the dark of the prairie around him without any of the old loneliness. The darkness was simply the darkness, and on the other side of it was the warm house and the stove and the bed and everything he had built and been given and was going to go on building. "Are you happy?" Henrietta asked, quietly, not wanting to wake Cole. It was not a testing question. She asked because she genuinely wanted to know and because she had earned the right to ask it. "Yes," Simon said, completely and without qualification. She moved closer against his side on the wagon seat. "Good," she said. "Me too." January and February brought their cold and their confinement, and by February's end Henrietta told him there would be a second child in September, which she announced with the same matter-of-fact directness as the first, and with a brightness in her eyes that told him everything about how she felt about it. Simon put his arms around her and held on. "Boy or girl?" he said. "We'll find out in September," she said. "September is a long time." "It is the nature of these things," she said. "In the meantime, I suggest we consider the matter of the chicken coop, which needs a new section." "You are suggesting that I should address the chicken coop rather than the fact that we're having another child." "I am suggesting that we can think about both simultaneously," she said. "The chicken coop is quite urgent. We're at 22 hens." 22 hens, Simon said. "It's a productive flock," she said with dignity. He kissed her forehead. "The chicken coop it is." The spring of 1882 came in with its renewal, and the farm entered its third full growing season with a confidence and capacity that was recognizable now as something established. They had a reputation in Caldwell as solid people with good land and good produce. Their corn was purchased by a grain merchant who came through each autumn. Their chickens' eggs were a fixture at market. Simon had begun helping August Beck and one other neighbor, a man named Patrick Cullens from 2 miles east, with various larger projects in the informal system of mutual labor that was how small farms sustained themselves in the territory. Henrietta had also, in the way she accumulated most things, become an informal clearinghouse of information in the local community. People asked her about crops and chickens and the best way to put up preserves, and she answered them fully and accurately. And she had helped 2 newer settler families on their initial setups with advice and sometimes with actual provisions, because she remembered what the beginning was like, and she had made a principle of passing forward what she'd received. Simon watched this and thought about what she'd said on that first evening, that she had thought her own way through the problem of asking for help and reached the conclusion that help was not a weakness. She had not changed that position since. She gave it freely. She accepted it the same way. There was a completeness to it, a consistency between belief and action. That was one of the things he found most remarkable about her. The second child arrived on the 3rd of September, 1882, and this time it was a girl, delivered quickly and with a minimum of the previous drama, which Marta attributed to second children generally having the decency to arrive with less production. Henrietta held her daughter in the September morning light and said, "Eleanor," and that was that settled. Eleanor Turner was a round, observant baby who watched the world from her first days, with a grave and assessing manner that Simon recognized as specifically Henrietta's. Cole, who was now 18 months and operating at a speed and noise level consistent with a small, determined tornado, inspected his new sister with interest, and then attempted to give her a wooden spoon, which she ignored, which Cole found deeply instructive about the nature of sisters. They were a family of 4, in the house that Henrietta had designed and Simon had built, on the land Henrietta had bought and both of them had tended, and the farm was real and established and going to be there tomorrow, and the day after and the day after that. In October of 1882, a letter came for Simon. He didn't receive many letters, and the handwriting on this one was unfamiliar. He opened it at the kitchen table and read it through once and then again. Henrietta watched his face change and said nothing, waiting. It was from a lawyer in Austin, Texas. Cole Turner, his brother, had before he died in the stampede been owed wages by the cattle outfit, and those wages had sat in an account while the outfit tried to trace family. They had finally found Simon via a roundabout path through Caldwell's postmaster. The amount was not large, $47 and some cents. The letter asked for Simon to confirm his identity and the money would be forwarded. Simon set the letter down. Henrietta came and read it over his shoulder and then sat down across from him. Cole kept working right up until the end, Simon said after a while. Yes, Henrietta said. He was owed $47 and they kept it for him. Yes, she said. Simon looked at the table. I'll write back, he said. Confirm the identity. What will you do with the money, she asked, not pressingly. Simon thought for a moment. I'd like to put it toward the new room, he said. The one we're planning for the children when they're older. Let it be the Cole Turner room. He paused. Is that strange? No, Henrietta said. That is exactly right. He looked at her, and she looked back at him. And in the simple exchange, he said and received everything that needed to be said and received about Cole Turner, who had been worth more than he got, and who was being honored in the most appropriate way possible, by having his name and his last earnings put into the building of something real and lasting. The years settled into their rhythm. 1883 brought a hard summer drought that tested everyone in the territory and sent some of the newer homesteaders back east. But Henrietta's creek and Simon's carefully maintained pastures, and the root cellar full from previous good years carried them through. They tightened on certain things and did not tighten on the children or the livestock that were the core of what they were building, and they came out the other side of the dry summer with the farm intact, leaner but not damaged. August Beck's farm also survived. Patrick Cullens lost one field of corn but kept his cattle. The 3 families in the informal community around them were all still standing in the fall, and that felt like something worth noting over the Christmas gathering at the Becks that year. Cole, who was approaching 3, had by now a vocabulary that concerned and delighted Simon in equal measure. He had inherited his mother's directness of expression and his father's tendency to observe before speaking, which was a combination that produced occasional declarations of startling accuracy. He told August Beck, at the Christmas gathering, that August's barn smelled like horses and also like happiness, which was so specifically true and so unexpectedly articulate from a 3-year-old that the room went silent for a moment before everyone laughed. That child, August said to Simon, is going to be something. He already is something, Simon said. Eleanor at 1 year was a solid and cheerful baby who pulled herself to standing along every piece of furniture she could reach and regarded the entire enterprise of the world with the calm interest of someone taking a thorough inventory. She was going to be methodical. Simon could already see it. She was going to be careful and precise and thorough. And then, having been all of those things, she was going to do exactly what she decided. Henrietta in miniature. The thought filled him with a warmth that had no bottom. By 1884, the farm was firmly in its prosperous middle years. They had 12 cattle, the best of whom Simon had given individual names. A habit Cole had started by naming one of them Frederick, for no stated reason, and a proper milk operation with 2 cows running at any time. The corn fields were running at 40 acres. The vegetable garden was Henrietta's particular domain, and produced with a reliability that was the product of 3 years of learning exactly what this soil and this light and this water required. They added to the house once more, the proper second room built from the Cole fund and its own accumulated means, a bedroom for the children, and Simon built 2 small beds into it with a shelf between them for their things and the carved wooden horse from Uncle John in St. Louis, which Cole treated as a sacred object and Alina merely tolerated. One evening in late summer 1884, they were sitting on the expanded porch Simon had built along the south face of the house, the children inside in their beds, the summer night around them, and Henrietta was reading and Simon was not doing anything in particular, just existing in the evening, which was one of the skills he had developed over the years on this farm and attributed entirely to her influence. "What do you think about a third?" Henrietta said, without looking up from her book. Simon looked at her. She looked up. Her eyes were bright with the particular combination of certainty and slightly held breath waiting that he knew from Cole's announcement and Alina's. "I think I would like 3, she said. "I think 3 feels right. 3 children on 160 acres, Simon said. "We've been good farmers," she said, "and they'll be good workers when they're old enough." "Alina is too," Simon said. "I know Alina is too," she said. "I was there when she arrived. She barely sleeps through the night." "She sleeps through the night most nights now," Henrietta said. Simon, "Yes," he said. "Do you want a third child?" she said, looking at him with those steady, honest eyes. Simon looked back at her. He thought about the farmhouse with all its rooms and its light. He thought about Cole's voice and Alina's particular way of looking at the world. He thought about himself at 31 on a porch in Caldwell whittling nothing and going nowhere and having, as she had put it precisely, nothing keeping him anywhere. "Yes," he said. "Yes, I want a third child." She smiled, and it was the full, warm smile he loved best, and she set down her book and moved close beside him on the porch, and he put his arm around her and she rested her head on his shoulder under the August stars. "I want to tell you something," Simon said after a while. "Tell me," she said. "When you hired me," he said. "When you sat down across from me in that saloon and told me you had a proposal, you said I looked like a man who had nothing keeping him anywhere." He paused. "You were right. I didn't. I had decided I didn't want anything keeping me anywhere because everywhere I'd ever been things came apart." Henrietta was quiet, listening. "I want you to know that I understand now what I didn't understand then," he said. "Things coming apart is not the lesson. Things coming apart is the condition. What you do with it, whether you try again, whether you show up the next morning and drive the next fence post, whether you let someone ask you for help and say yes, that's the lesson. You taught me that. You have been teaching me that since the first morning you stood in a market square with a broken wheel and asked if anyone had a skill that was actually useful." Henrietta lifted her head from his shoulder and looked at him in the summer dark. Her eyes were very bright. "You taught yourself," she said, quietly but firmly. "I just asked the question. You answered it." "You asked very persistently," he said. "I am a persistent person," she agreed. "It is one of your very best qualities," he said, along with a significant number of others. She kissed him, there on the porch in the August night, with the farm around them and the children inside and the stars above and the Kansas grass whispering in the warm wind. And Simon held his wife and felt the whole full weight of the life he had been handed and had chosen, simultaneously, and was grateful for both. Their third child, a boy they named Henry for Henrietta, she said when he asked, and also because it was a good solid name for a person arrived in the spring of 1885, another March baby like the farm itself, coming in with the first good weather. He was loud and vigorous from his first hour, and Cole, who was 4, greeted him with the authority of an older sibling, and informed him immediately about Frederick the cow and the best way to get Biscuit to follow you, and Alina watched with her grave 2-year-old expression and appeared to be reserving judgment. The farm in 1885 was a full and established working operation, and Simon Turner, who had arrived with nothing but a horse and a bedroll and the skill in his hands, was a farmer and a husband and a father and a neighbor and a man who had found, piece by piece, what he'd given up looking for, the reason to build something, the reason to stay. On a spring morning in April 1885, 6 years to the month from the day Henrietta had rolled into Caldwell with her broken wheel, Simon was in the field turning the first soil of the planting season, and he looked up and saw her coming across the field toward him with Henry in the carrier on her chest, and Cole running ahead of her chasing something in the grass, and Alina walking with her small, deliberate steps. The April sky was tremendous. The field ran dark and ready around him. The house sat on the rise behind them, permanent and real, with its sod roof greening in the spring. Henrietta reached him and stood in the turned soil with the baby on her chest and her face tipped up toward the sun, and she said, "The creek is running high but clean. Beck says it's a good sign for the summer." "Beck is usually right," Simon said. She looked at the field, then at him. "6 years ago this month," she said. "I was thinking that," he said. "What were you thinking about it?" He looked at his wife, who had arrived with a broken wheel and a land claim and a plan, and a quality of determination that the Kansas plain itself might have envied, who had asked him if he would help her build something, who had trusted him with the things that mattered, who had given him Cole and Alina and Henry, and the farm, and the accumulated days of a life that had turned out to be the best possible version of the thing he'd given up on. "I was thinking," Simon said, "that a broken wheel was the best thing that ever happened to me." Henrietta laughed, that real, full laugh, and Cole, who had come back having lost whatever he was chasing, asked why she was laughing, and she scooped him up one-armed, which he was almost too big for and did not mind, and said, "Because your father said something very good," and Cole said, "Papa is sometimes good at things," which made Simon laugh out loud in the April morning. Alina had reached them by now and stood and looked at the family assembled in the field, and then she put her small hand into Simon's and looked up at him with her mother's eyes. "Seeds," she said. "Seeds," Simon agreed. He took his daughter's hand and they walked back toward the barn for the seed sacks, and behind him he could hear Henrietta talking to Cole about the creek and the season and what they were going to plant where, her voice carrying easily in the spring air, clear and warm and certain. Henry made a sound of agreement from her chest, which may have been agreement or may have been lunch-related. It was sometimes difficult to tell with Henry. The farm waited around them, everything they had built and planted and tended, everything real and standing and growing, and the day opened itself up with its particular Kansas largeness, enormous sky and long flat land, and the green of coming spring rising through the turned earth. Simon Turner, who had once been a man with no family and no reason to build anything, walked to his barn in the April morning and was, without question or reservation, exactly where he was supposed to be. He was home. And he knew with the absolute certainty of a man who has been without a home long enough to know the difference, that home was not a place you were given but a place you built, piece by piece, in the company of someone who was worth building for. The seasons would go on turning. There would be hard summers and good ones, early frosts and late rains, and the 1,000 ordinary complications of a farming life. There would be the year Cole broke his arm falling from the fence he'd been told repeatedly not to climb, and the year Alina planted her own garden section at the age of 5 and kept the records in a small notebook she'd made herself from folded paper. There would be the year Henry declared his intention to be a horse, which lasted 3 weeks and required some gentle management. There would be the evening Henrietta read aloud from the newspaper about the ongoing difficulties of the territory, and they talked, seriously and honestly, about the injustices being done to the native people whose land this had been before it was open to homestead. And Henrietta wrote a letter to the county commissioner that said what she thought, which was the kind of person she had always been. There would be the morning Simon rode out to check the north fence and found it down in 3 places and came home to tell Henrietta, and she said, "Then we'll fix it," which was what she always said, and they always did. There would be the evening years on when Cole, grown tall and serious, sat with his father on the porch and asked him what the land had been like when they first came. And Simon told him about the broken wheel and the market square, and the 50 cents he'd been paid for a job he'd have done for nothing. And Cole listened the way Henrietta listened, with his whole attention, and said, "That's how everything good starts, isn't it? With someone asking for help and someone saying yes." "That's exactly how it starts," Simon said. There would be the morning Henrietta found him in the field very early, before the family was awake, just standing in the corn rows looking east at the horizon, and she came out without a word and stood beside him, and they watched the sun come up over the Kansas plain together in the early quiet, and after a while she said, "Are you all right?" And he said, "More than all right," and she took his hand and they stood there in the new morning, and it was, as it had always been, enough and more than enough in everything. The land held, the house held, the family grew. And Simon Turner, who had no family left and no reason to build anything, built everything, beside the woman who had shown up and asked if he would help, and the answer had been yes, and the answer went on being yes, every single morning for the rest of his life.